Imagine you're living in 1644. England is torn by civil war. A king claims absolute power, answering to God alone. And a Scottish pastor asks a dangerous question. What if the king is wrong? Samuel Rutherford didn't set out to write one of history's most revolutionary political texts. He was a minister, a scholar of Hebrew and theology, known for his passionate sermons and tender pastoral letters. But when King Charles I demanded absolute obedience and began persecuting those who resisted his religious policies, Rutherford picked up his pen and wrote a book that would shake the foundations of monarchy itself. The title was Latin, Lex, Rex, the law and the prince. But the message was explosive. Law is king, not the other way around. For centuries, European monarchs had claimed to rule by divine right. The idea was simple and powerful. God appointed kings to rule, and to resist the king was to resist God himself. Kings were accountable to heaven alone, not to their subjects or any earthly law. This wasn't just political theory, it was the foundation of absolute monarchy. Charles I embraced this doctrine fully. When Parliament challenged his authority, he dissolved it. When religious dissenters questioned his policies, he imprisoned them. When the Scottish Church resisted his attempts to impose Anglican worship, he went to war. And through it all, he insisted that as God's anointed, his word was law. Many Christians accepted this. After all, didn't Romans 13 command submission to governing authorities? Didn't Scripture say rulers were ordained by God? To rebel against the king seemed to rebel against God's established order. But Rutherford saw a problem. If kings truly answered to no one but God, if their will was absolute, then there was no protection against tyranny. A wicked king could oppress, plunder, and murder with impunity, and Christians would have no recourse but silent suffering. Something didn't add up. Rutherford began with Scripture, but he read it differently. Yes, God established government. Yes, Christians should honor rulers. But when Rutherford looked at the Old Testament, he didn't see absolute monarchy, he saw covenant. When Israel asked for a king, God warned them through Samuel. Kings would take their sons for armies, their daughters for servants, their fields and vineyards for themselves. Kingship would be costly. But notice what happened when Israel got their kings. They were bound by God's law. When King Saul disobeyed, God rejected him. When David sinned, prophets confronted him. When later kings turned to idolatry, they were overthrown. The pattern was clear. Even kings lived under the law. They were not the source of law, but its servants. God's law stood above them, judging their actions, limiting their power. This was covenant thinking. A covenant is a binding agreement with mutual obligations. It's not one party dictating to another, it's two parties committing to specific terms. And in Scripture, Rutherford saw that kings entered into covenant with their people under God's law. They promised to rule justly, the people promised to obey. But if the king broke covenant, the agreement was void. This led Rutherford to ask, where does political power come from? The divine right theorists said it flowed directly from God to the king. But Rutherford proposed something different. Yes, all authority ultimately comes from God. But God gives political power to the community, to the people collectively. They then entrust it to rulers for the common good. The ruler is not the owner of power, but its steward, holding it in trust for the sake of justice and the welfare of the people. Think of it like this. A king is like a guardian appointed for a child. The guardian has real authority, real responsibility. But the authority exists for the child's benefit, not the guardian's. And if the guardian abuses that trust, stealing from the child or harming them, others have the right to intervene and remove the guardian. This was radical. Rutherford was saying that political authority is conditional. It exists for a purpose, the protection and flourishing of the people. When a ruler pursues that purpose, they deserve honor and obedience. But when they abandon that purpose, when they become tyrants, they've forfeited their legitimate authority. Rutherford spent hundreds of pages carefully arguing that all earthly power must be limited. No human should have absolute, unchecked authority because all humans are fallen, prone to corruption and abuse. He distinguished between just authority and tyranny. A lawful king rules according to law for the good of the people, recognizing limits to his power. A tyrant rules by his own will, for his own benefit, acknowledging no limits but force. One is a father to his people, the other is a thief. And here's what made Rutherford's argument so powerful. He didn't just appeal to political philosophy, he grounded it in Christian theology. Human nature is corrupted by sin. Give sinful humans unlimited power, and they will abuse it. This isn't cynicism, it's realism based on the doctrine of the fall. Therefore, government must be structured with checks and balances. Power must be divided, limited by law, accountable to the people and their representatives. Not because we don't trust good rulers, but because we can't guarantee that all rulers will be good. The system must protect us from tyranny. This was constitutional thinking before the age of written constitutions. Rutherford was arguing for the rule of law, for limited government, for structures that prevent the concentration of unchecked power. But Rutherford went further. What if, despite all safeguards, a ruler becomes a tyrant? What if the king ignores law, oppresses the people, and persecutes the faithful? Do Christians simply submit and suffer? Here Rutherford made his most controversial claim. The people, through their lawful representatives, have the right to resist tyranny. Not rebellion resistance. Not anarchy constitutional opposition. He was careful to define terms. Private individuals shouldn't take up arms against bad laws they don't like. That would be chaos. But when a ruler becomes a systematic tyrant, violating fundamental law and the rights of the people, the community acting through its constitutional structures, parliaments, magistrates, representative bodies has the right and even the duty to resist. This wasn't a call for revolution every time someone disagreed with the king. Rutherford emphasized that resistance must be measured, legal, and led by legitimate authorities. But he insisted that submission to earthly rulers is not absolute. When human authority commands what God forbids or forbids what God commands, we must obey God rather than men. Think of the Hebrew midwives who defied Pharaoh's command to kill baby boys. Think of Daniel's friends who refused to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Scripture honors those who resisted unjust authority for the sake of conscience and divine law. Rutherford was applying that principle to politics. A tyrannical king who commands injustice has stepped outside his lawful authority. To resist him is not to rebel against legitimate government, but to defend it. The book landed like a bombshell. Published in 1644 as the English Civil War raged, Lex Rex provided intellectual and theological ammunition for Parliament's cause against Charles I. It was read, debated, cited. But it also made Rutherford enemies. Royalists denounced it as treasonous. When Charles Roman II was restored to the throne in 1660, one of his first acts was to ban the book. It was publicly burned. Rutherford himself was charged with treason. By then, Rutherford was old and dying. Summoned to trial, he reportedly said, "I have got a summons already before a superior judge and judicatory, and I behoved to answer my first summons, and ere your day arrive, I will be where few kings and great folks come." He died before he could be executed, but the authorities burned Lex Rex at his grave as a symbol. Yet the ideas wouldn't die. Students smuggled copies. Pastors quoted arguments from memory. The principles spread. Within a generation, Rutherford's ideas were flowing into mainstream political thought. John Locke, writing his 2 treatises of government in the 1680s, made remarkably similar arguments. Government exists by consent, power is held in trust, people have the right to resist tyranny. Locke's work influenced the American founders. When Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. When he listed grievances against King George to justify resistance, he was walking a path Rutherford had cleared. The idea that law stands above rulers, that power must be limited, that constitutions protect liberty, these became foundational to modern democracy. We take them for granted now, but they were revolutionary in Rutherford's time. And notice the source. These weren't secular ideas imposed on Christianity. They emerged from deep reflection on Scripture, from covenant theology, from taking seriously both human dignity as image bearers and human corruption through the fall. Rutherford's arguments raise questions that remain urgent. How do we balance respect for authority with accountability? When does legitimate government become tyranny? What are the limits of civil obedience? We face these questions differently than 17th century Scotland. We have democratic structures Rutherford could barely imagine. We can vote out leaders without armed resistance. Yet the fundamental issues remain. What do we do when government commands injustice? When does loyalty to earthly authority conflict with loyalty to God? How do we structure power to prevent abuse? These aren't just political questions, they are theological ones, questions about how God's kingdom relates to earthly kingdoms. Rutherford would remind us that all authority is derivative and limited, that rulers are servants, not masters, that law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to magnify the powerful, that Christians are citizens of a kingdom that relativizes all earthly thrones. Lex, Rex, the law and the prince. The title says it all. In a world where kings claim to be the law, Rutherford insisted that law is king. Not just any law rooted in God's justice, protecting human dignity, pursuing the common good. Law that limits power, ensures accountability, and guards against tyranny. This matters because humans are both glorious and fallen, made in God's image, capable of justice and wisdom, but corrupted by sin, prone to abuse power when unchecked. The solution isn't to abandon government, we need it for order and justice, but it's to structure government with humility, recognizing human limitations, to build in checks, balances, accountability, to ensure that power serves people, not the other way around. Samuel Rutherford wrote in a specific time, addressing specific abuses, but he tapped into principles deeper than any political moment. Principles rooted in how God designed human community, how sin has affected it, and how justice can still be pursued in a fallen world. And here's what's beautiful. Rutherford's political theology points beyond itself to an even deeper reality. All earthly authority is temporary, limited, and accountable because there's only one absolute king. When Rutherford argued that human kings must submit to law, he was ultimately saying they must submit to the King of Kings. When he insisted on limits to earthly power, he was protecting space for God's ultimate authority. When he defended the right of conscience, he was acknowledging that humans answer first to their Creator. The biblical story moves toward a kingdom where justice rolls down like waters, where the earth is full of the knowledge of the Lord, where the King himself is the source of perfect law and perfect love. A kingdom not established by violence or maintained by tyranny, but given by grace and received by faith. Until that kingdom comes in fullness, we live in the tension. We honor earthly authority as God's servants, but we refuse to give any human the worship, the absolute allegiance, the unchecked power that belongs to God alone. Lex, Rex, invites us to think carefully about power, justice, and the proper ordering of human community, not with naive optimism that ignores human sinfulness, but also not with cynical despair that abandons the pursuit of justice. Instead, with realistic hope, hope that acknowledges how broken we are but also remembers whose image we bear. Hope that knows earthly kingdoms will fail, but that God's kingdom is coming. Hope that works for justice now while waiting for the King who will set all things right. Samuel Rutherford spent his final years comforting the persecuted, writing letters filled with longing for Christ. Facing death, threatened with execution for his political writings, he found peace in a kingdom that no earthly power could touch. That's the gift of seeing political life through the lens of God's story. We can work for justice without making politics ultimate. We can resist tyranny without descending into hate. We can honor earthly authority while keeping our deepest loyalty for the only king who deserves it. Lex, Rex, the law and the prince. It's a reminder that all human authority is limited, all human power is accountable, and all earthly thrones bow before one supreme throne. The question for us is the same one Rutherford asked. Will we build communities that reflect that reality? Will we structure power with humility? Will we pursue justice while acknowledging our own brokenness? Will we give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but keep for God alone what belongs to God? These are the questions Lex, Rex leaves us with, and they're as urgent today as they were in 1644.